What if I told you that the absolute most terrifying number in human history, a completely incomprehensible figure of $315 trillion, is not actually a mathematically unpayable bill owed to a shadowy galactic landlord, but is instead the foundational psychological illusion that powers the entire modern global economy? Welcome to money's hidden past. Rich people lied. We fact-checked today. We are stripping down the harsh structural mechanics of the global debt matrix and exposing exactly who actually owns the absolute staggering sovereign debt of the world. When the traditional mainstream financial media discusses the global economy, they constantly broadcast the absolute terrifying statistic that the world owes $315 trillion, flashing massive red digital numbers across the television screen to induce total retail panic, and convincing the exhausted working-class consumer that the entire planet is completely mathematically bankrupt. The human brain is structurally incapable of comprehending a number of that absolute massive magnitude. So the ordinary citizen naturally attempts to conceptualize the global debt through the lens of household finance, blindly assuming that if the entire physical planet is deeply, deeply in debt, there must be a massive, centralized shadowy bank sitting at the center of the universe actively collecting the payments. The legacy media wants you to picture a global cosmic landlord, a completely invisible corporate entity, holding the physical mortgage to planet Earth, preparing to violently foreclose on the entire human race the absolute second we miss a massive interest payment. But the actual unyielding mathematical reality of global finance is significantly darker and completely different. Global sovereign finance absolutely does not operate like your traditional household budget. There is no centralized bank of Earth holding the physical paperwork to the planetary debt, because the global economy is a completely sealed and entirely closed mathematical loop, meaning the massive astronomical debt is not owed to a foreign planetary entity, but is actually owed entirely to ourselves. To completely understand the absolute structural reality of the $315 trillion liability, you must aggressively strip away the corporate financial jargon and track the physical flow of the paper. Because when a sovereign government decides to actively spend more capital than it extracts in physical taxes, it is mathematically forced to borrow the difference by issuing a piece of physical paper known as a sovereign bond. The sovereign bond is simply a mathematical promise to repay the capital with a guaranteed yield of interest. But the entities purchasing these massive sovereign bonds are not shadowy alien billionaires. The absolute primary creditors holding the massive bags of sovereign debt are the everyday working class citizens and the massive institutional entities that physically manage their money. The absolute largest holders of the sovereign national debt are massive global pension funds and retirement accounts. When a working class citizen diligently funnels their fiat currency into a physical 401k or a massive sovereign state, extracts mandatory contributions for a national retirement pension, and those massive institutional fund managers are mathematically forced to find absolute safe and reliable returns. They absolutely cannot take billions of dollars of working class retirement capital and blindly gamble it on highly volatile experimental technology stocks or unproven corporate derivatives. They are structurally mandated by federal law to anchor their massive portfolios with absolute predictable assets, making the government's sovereign bond the absolute fundamental staple of the entire global retirement architecture. This exposes the ultimate psychological trap of the modern sovereign financial system. The government aggressively borrows billions of dollars to fund their massive, unyielding political agendas, and they borrow that physical capital directly from the retirement accounts of the exact same working-class citizens, meaning you are simultaneously the exhausted taxpayer, funding the debt, and the structural creditor, holding the underlying asset. But the massive extraction does not mathematically end with the global pension funds. The second massive pillar of sovereign debt ownership rests completely with domestic commercial banks and massive corporations, because inside the highly complex regulatory framework of modern fractional reserve banking, commercial banks are legally required to hold massive volumes of highly liquid physical cash reserves, but holding absolute physical cash in a massive vault generates zero thermodynamic yield. So the traditional banking monopolies securely park their massive physical capital reserves inside short-term government bonds, utilizing the sovereign debt of their own nation as the ultimate highly liquid collateral to balance their corporate books and mathematically satisfying the strict Federal Reserve requirements, while simultaneously generating a tiny, predictable corporate profit. This means the very foundation of the commercial banking sector absolutely requires the existence of sovereign debt, if the federal government miraculously paid off the entire national debt. Tomorrow morning, the massive commercial banking architecture would completely violently collapse because they would possess absolutely no mathematically secure asset to function as their foundational baseline collaterals. The third massive structural pillar of global debt ownership involves the highly complex international geopolitical chessboard where foreign sovereign nations aggressively purchase and stockpile the debt of other competing nations, not as a gesture of international goodwill or global diplomatic friendship, but as a highly calculated structural mechanism to aggressively manipulate global currency exchange rates when a massive exporting powerhouse like China or Japan manufactures physical goods and sells them to the American consumer. They extract billions of physical American Fiat dollars in exchange for their thermodynamic physical labor. But if they attempt to instantly convert all of those paper dollars back into their own domestic currency, they would violently inflate the physical value of their own currency and immediately destroy their absolute export advantage. So instead of converting the capital, they utilize the American dollars to aggressively purchase United States Treasury bonds, physically hoarding the sovereign debt of the American empire to artificially keep their own currency highly competitive, and creating a massive, unbreakable mathematical chain of mutual financial destruction, where global superpowers are completely forced to hold each other's physical debt to successfully facilitate international trade. The mainstream media completely refuses to properly explain the circular unyielding matrix. The vast, massive majority of the United States national debt is not owned by shadowy, hostile foreign entities. It is mathematically owned by American citizens, domestic corporate businesses, and the United States government itself. Through massive internal entities like the Social Security Trust Fund trading physical paper with the Treasury Department. But to truly completely grasp the terrifying architecture of the $315 trillion number, you must understand the absolute most critical, unyielding rule of the modern fiat casino. In our completely unbacked centralized financial system, money and debt are literally the exact same physical mechanism. They are two sides of the exact same structural mathematical coin. Before the massive catastrophic Nixon shock of 1971, money was a physical representation of actual thermodynamic reality, mathematically tethered to physical gold. But in the modern era of unrestricted global fiat currency, money literally does not physically exist until a sovereign entity explicitly borrows it into existence. When the massive unelected central bank decides it desperately needs to artificially stimulate the domestic economy, they do not physically print pallets of physical paper cash and drop them out of a physical helicopter. They execute a highly sophisticated digital maneuver known as open market operations, where the central bank digitally conjures liquid capital out of completely thin air. They utilize this freshly conjured digital capital to aggressively purchase existing government bonds from the commercial banks, instantly injecting billions of dollars of highly liquid fiat currency directly into the physical economy, meaning every single digital dollar currently resting inside your physical commercial bank account was originally birthed into existence as a unit of sovereign corporate debt. This is exactly why the total amount of global sovereign debt has to be mathematically massive. The entire $315 trillion figure is not a mistake or a temporary structural anomaly. It is the absolute explicit required collateral that props up the entire global commercial banking system. If the massive global debt stops artificially expanding, the entire supply of physical global money violently contracts this terrifying unyielding reality, brings us directly to the absolute biggest misconception in global finance. The exhausted working class consumer looks at the massive sovereign debt and asks how it will ever be paid off, applying the strict mathematical rules of their own human physical mortality to the absolute sovereign state, failing to understand that a sovereign government operates under a completely different set of biological physics when an ordinary physical human being signs the paperwork for a massive 30-year residential mortgage. They are locked into a race against their own unyielding biological cellular degradation. Because you possess a completely finite human lifespan, you absolutely must eventually pay off the principal balance before your physical thermodynamic energy completely runs out and you leave the physical Earth. But a massive sovereign nation-state does not possess a biological cellular lifespan. The United States government does not intend to eventually retire to a physical beach in Florida. A sovereign empire is theoretically, mathematically immortal and possesses the unyielding power of perpetual taxation, meaning the government literally never plans to actually pay off the foundational principle of the national debt. Instead, the political elite execute the most massive structural Ponzi scheme in the history of human civilization when a massive 30-year government bond officially reaches its mathematical maturity date. The sovereign treasury does not reach into a physical vault and extract the cash to pay off the massive principal. They simply issue a brand new freshly printed bond to aggressively pay off the old expired bond. This deeply cynical financial maneuver is officially known in the corporate banking sector as rolling over the debt, and it completely eliminates the physical thermodynamic requirement to ever balance the actual sovereign checkbook. As long as the underlying physical economy continues to artificially grow through aggressive central bank stimulation, and the sovereign government can successfully continue to extract enough physical taxes to service the baseline interest payments, they can carry the massive astronomical debt load indefinitely into the infinite mathematical future, kicking the catastrophic financial can down the endless road of generational time and passing the unyielding mathematical burden to the unborn children of the exhausted working class, who will be structurally forced to service the massive interest payments on capital they never legally consented to borrow. The global economy is absolutely not in debt to a massive cosmic landlord demanding physical restitution. It is a completely closed-loop thermodynamic system where one man's terrifying sovereign liability operates as the absolute foundational collateral and primary asset for another man's institutional portfolio, functioning as the absolute primary tool for money creation by the unelected central banks. The entire $315 trillion architectural matrix is an endless interconnected chain of digital promises and paper obligations, built entirely on the fragile, unyielding confidence in a nation's future economic physical output, and the absolute guarantee that the working class will continue to wake up every single Monday morning and produce physical value. The absolute second the global population stops blindly believing in the sovereign mathematical illusion and recognizes that the $315 trillion represents a permanent, unpayable physical extraction. The entire completely fragile Fiat casino will violently collapse into the digital ether, because debt is only mathematically sustainable as long as the underlying population refuses to demand physical reality. The massive legacy conglomerates and the sovereign central bankers desperately want you to ignore this architectural truth. They want you to stare blindly at the terrifying red numbers on the traditional financial television screens and willingly accept your unyielding status as a permanent debt slave inside the global fiat matrix, completely failing to realize that the entire architectural system relies entirely on your physical participation. If you aggressively train your mind to ignore the superficial corporate financial noise, you will suddenly recognize that the global sovereign debt is not a physical, unyielding math problem to be eventually solved. It is the absolute primary mechanism of permanent working class control, designed specifically to ensure that your physical energy is constantly extracted to subsidize the political elite. If this massive comprehensive breakdown of the $315 trillion global debt illusion and the dark, unyielding math behind the sovereign bond market fired you up about taking absolute total control of your permanent financial architecture, then do me a massive favor right now. Smash that like button to let the algorithm know this factual historical conversation matters. Share this video with every friend and family member who needs to understand how the real financial world operates. Let us keep exposing the true mechanics of wealth and power. I will catch you in the next one, where we break down the next hidden chapter in the long history of money and corporate authority. Until then, stay informed, stay skeptical, and remember that the greatest financial weapon in the modern global economy is completely refusing to anchor your personal physical wealth to an endless chain of sovereign mathematical promises.